Good afternoon and welcome. Our conversation today is all about the gender pay gap, and with me are Dr. Lisa Wilson from the Nevin Economic Research Institute, or NERI, and Gareth Murphy, my colleague from Financial Services Union. Lisa Wilson is a senior economist at NERI and is based in their Belfast office. Her main research interests lie in the areas of labour markets, income distribution, poverty, public expenditure, living standards and well-being. And since taking up her position in NERI, Lisa has been, among other things, carrying out work concerned with job quality and its economic and social importance in the future of work and the gendered nature of employment. Gareth is Head of Industrial Relations and Campaigns at Financial Services Union, who recently published a report on the gender pay gap, which was presented by the FSU to the Minister, Roderick O'Gorman, just last week. So Lisa, if I can go to you first, can you explain exactly what the gender pay gap is and how it's different to equal pay? Because I feel there are people who actually don't understand or get it. And then secondly, do you think this should be a priority for unions and employers?
Thanks very much, Sharon, and thanks very much for having me along this afternoon and giving me the opportunity to talk through some of the analysis that was fed through to the FSU report. And it's excellent to see the FSU being so forefront in terms of bringing forward a key piece of research and doing some analysis, presenting it to the Minister on the gender pay gap, and really trying to get to grips and understand this area, which, as you say, there is a lack of understanding around about what the gender pay gap is. So very often in terms of conversations when we talk about the gender pay gap, you very often have different people actually talking about different things and a misinterpretation about what we are actually referring to when we talk about the gender pay gap. So quite often you have people appear to understand the gender pay gap, as you said, about that concept of equal pay for equal work or work of equal value, and to understand the gender pay gap as being about discriminatory pay, and for that reason they say gender, it's illegal to pay males and females differently for doing the same work or for doing work of equal value. But the gender pay gap is a concept which is broader than that. And the gender pay gap is about the difference between the earnings of males and females within the labour market. So it's really about what are the differential economic returns whenever a female goes out to work and a male goes out to work. What is the difference in their pay packs at the end of the week, irrespective of whether or not it's happening because of discriminatory reasons, or whether it's happening because males and females, whenever they engage in our labour market, they engage differently because they have different characteristics, and these different characteristics are rewarded differently. To make that point, so for example, males and females often have different levels of educational attainment. Males and females often work different hours. We know that females are much more likely than males to work part-time, and males will be much more likely to work full-time. Males and females are dominated within our labour market within particular sectors, but also within particular occupations whenever they're in a sector. So they're dominated, they're much more likely to be in the lower paid occupations within the sector. So the gender pay gap tries to capture all of that in one place and say, irrespective of all those reasons, let's just look then when males and females are paid their wages or what have you, what is the difference in how much they actually take home? And we know that there is quite a substantial gap in the earnings between males and females within the labour market. Your second question, sorry, Sharon, you were saying about what
should it be a priority issue for unions and employers, bridging that gender pay gap?
Yes, and this is why it's so welcome that the FSU have actually went and done some detailed analysis on the gender pay gap within that sector, because when we look within the finance sector, as this report by the FSU has done, what we're seeing is significant and quite substantial gaps in the earnings between males and females who are employed within the finance sector. So in 2018, that's the year for which there's the latest data is available, which is an issue in and of itself. But we see that females on average earned just under 49,000 over the year, whilst males in the same sector earned just under 75,000. That's a gap of almost 26,000 euros in the year between the average earnings of females and males employed in this sector. Huge gap in terms of the earnings. So of course it needs to be a priority. We need to look and understand the reasons why males and females earnings are so huge and so vastly different within this sector, to the detriment of females, where their pay packets are 34% gap lower than males and females. So both for the individual worker, for the union to be able to take this up on behalf of all the workers that they represent, but also for employers and for policymakers to really start to say, hang on a second, there's huge gaps here in terms of the earnings, and let's try to understand that a little bit better. So it's really good that now the FSU are equipped with this report, with the information to go out and to utilise the evidence base that you now have to get some action in place.
Thanks, Lisa. Like, there are stunning statistics, I think, for the banking and finance industry. And would you have any idea of how that compares to other industries in Ireland who maybe publish information?
Yeah, so as well within the report and some of the analysis that I had done for the report for the FSU was to compare the size of the gender pay gap across different sectors, and to rank where the finance sector sat there. And you're seeing the finance sector right up the top. The gap is widest there, so it's a huge issue for this sector, and it's something that really needs was, I think, under acknowledged beforehand. But as I say, now that the evidence base is there, clear in black and white, coming from official statistics, you have that evidence base to say it's the gender pay gap is a particular issue of concern for this sector.
Thanks, Lisa. Turning to you now, Gareth, the FSU have a series of recommendations for agreed targets and actions at the end of the report. And can you talk us through a few of them and why you think they're important? And do you really think that they will make a difference to the gender pay gap?
Yeah, thanks very much, Sharon. So I suppose firstly, I want to thank Dr. Lisa Wilson for helping FSU produce this report. Lisa's also provided a very detailed briefing to our negotiating teams in our trade union in terms of the details of how to calculate the various different calculations in terms of the gender pay gap as well, which is really important in terms of equipping trade unions to understand and to challenge employers in terms of that level of information and detail around the gender pay gap. So I just want to thank Lisa for that support to our union in producing this. But like you say, it's one thing to analyze a sector and understand information. It's another thing then to change it and to challenge it. And I know, there's increasing political pressure on the government to remove restrictions on the pay and bonuses of CEOs and top bankers. And you contrast that, is there the same political pressure on employers to actually address the gender pay gap? And sadly, I don't think there is, although this union is now actively campaigning to put that kind of pressure on the employers and on the government to really significantly address the gender pay gap. So this report that we've launched, that we have here, it's not just the analysis of the information, it's also attempting to put forward some ideas. And I would say not every idea, and this is only to some degree the start of actually putting out what are the concrete demands we can make of employers to address it. I suppose one of the first ones we'd call for is that pay ranges themselves and pay increases themselves are published and made transparent for workers to see. We're really beginning to see, especially in the broader private sector and elements of the financial services sector, pay secrecy come into play, where employers actually refuse to publish pay ranges. Workers don't know what their salary scale range is. They don't know if they're getting the same increase for the same work as their colleague. And there's all this kind of secrecy around it. In some sectors, even, there are non-disclosure agreements put into contracts of employment that people are not actually allowed to talk about pay. So if we really want to address the gender pay gap, one of the first things employers have to do is publish pay information, pay ranges, rates of pay, by role, etc. And that will allow, initially anyway, workers to at least see what their role is valued in their organization, what roles are actually paid a lot versus what roles are not paid a lot. And I think that will help. Also, obviously, we've done a lot of work on lobbying governments and the Assembly in Northern Ireland on the gender pay information bill. And we welcome, as a starting point, the legislative efforts to make employers actually publish the gender pay gap. But that's only really a starting point. And we actually want to see employers have to agree reduction targets and have to agree actions with trade unions and trade union representatives on what they can tangibly do to address the gender pay gap, because often it is reduced down to, well, we need more female CEOs, or we need more females at the top of an organization, which obviously itself is very important. And of course, we need equal representation at top levels and senior levels, absolutely. But that itself won't end the gender pay gap if there is a gender distribution of roles more broadly within an employment. So if all of the entry level or all of the part-time workers, for example, as Lisa pointed to, are female, well, then you're still going to have a big gender pay gap in an organization. So we need a holistic approach and a list of actions that employers will actually take. And another one of those can be, for example, auditing performance pay increases and auditing performance ratings from a gender perspective. So putting it through a gender analysis to make sure that actually performance increases and performance ratings are fair throughout a year and are not biased. A small piece of research we've done in one of our employments identified that part-time workers are far more likely to get the average performance rating in an employment, and much less, significantly less likely to get one of the top ratings. And what that really tells us is that part-time workers are really just given the middle rating. There isn't a whole lot of analysis done of our actual performance. They're just kind of given the middle rating. We also know from that same piece of research that 99.7% of those part-time workers were female. And what that actually means is they are going to get less of an increase than some of their full-time colleagues who are more likely to be male, even if their actual performance during the year is the same. That's going to create gender discrimination and gender pay gap within roles and within ranges. So we do feel that things like performance management ratings and performance increases need to be analysed each year to make sure that there isn't gender discrimination. That's just a couple of the recommendations we've made.
Thanks, Gareth. And if we go back to you, Lisa, do you think that the issue of collective bargaining has any role to play in closing the gender pay gap, or is it just something that unions are always calling for?
No, collective bargaining is absolutely fundamental to collectively being able to do something which is proactive about the gender pay gap, both and will be really beneficial both from the actual workers and the unions point of view, but also from the employer's side. Very often, as you just kind of alluded to, that, you know, this is something that unions are always going on about. Actually, I think if employers took the time to understand collective bargaining in terms of what it's seeking to achieve, they'd be much more likely to get on board with it, because it is about trying to come up with an agreement with all of your workers about how do you how can we collectively work and equip ourselves to drive down some of the gaps and some of the reasons sitting in behind that. So, as Gareth said, one of the this big the legislatory piece, which has taken place in both the Republic and in Northern Ireland, about pay transparency and the legal requirement on employers to publish their gender pay gaps. Very often what you're finding from employers is that they're not being then obliged to have action plans in place to actually do something about it. But very often they're left in a position where they're kind of going, well, what can I do about it? They don't actually fully understand that there is structural reasons there to explain the gender pay gap, and the benefit which collective bargaining agreement can help to help with those structural reasons, so that having that conversations between employers, unions, and government to say there's structural reasons there that you as an individual bank or you as an individual company might not be entirely responsible for, but this is something we're seeing right across the labour market or right across the sector, and let's look at these structural reasons and put into place a framework which can enable you to close and narrow that gender pay gap. And that's the point that I wanted to pick up on from what Gareth just said about the pay transparency legislation and as it links to the collective bargaining. There's a real fear that I have with the pay transparency legislation that if it is not linked to the requirement for actions, and it's not linked to the requirement for goals and to actually do something about it, that it becomes a news day once a year where you're splattered in the front page of the news, the gender pay gap in X bank or the gender pay gap in this bank is, so distraught. But the news turns on to the next day, and we now have the next story coming out, and we kind of over a period of time become weathered to the fact that the gender pay gap exists, and weathered to the fact that in particular banks or particular sectors have huge pay gaps. So that piece of legislation, while so important, not linking it to the collective bargaining framework and giving both employers and unions and government, because ultimately the government, with the pay transparency legislation is signalling that they want to do something about it, without having that framework, which can really help to put in that framework in place to narrow the gap over a period of time, will really help.
Thanks, Lisa. I have a question for both of you. And when I was preparing for today, this really struck me, and it was about, the effect that COVID would have. And I come to the conclusion myself, without any empirical evidence, that it really could only further damage the gender pay gap. Maybe ask you, Lisa, have you any thoughts about that first?
Yeah, so actually, it's a really interesting question, both from, I suppose, an anecdotal. I'll give my kind of anecdotal point, and then kind of give my economist head. But right at the very first kind of COVID lockdown, I was on maternity leave actually, and I was at the point at which childcare and creches and schools and everything was shut down. And I remember kind of sitting and thinking to myself, the implications this is going to have, I was just a first time mother, and I was kind of going, if I was trying to juggle this and do work, I would not be able to do it. And but I was on maternity leave, so in many ways I was lucky I wasn't having to juggle that. But many of my friends and many of my colleagues were faced with that challenge of having to negotiate, having to do their work, and look after children. And then that's when I kind of flipped to my economist side, is that what actually happened throughout the COVID crisis was that because we were faced with that time period for public health reasons, where our creches or schools or childcare facilities were shut down, and many were placed working from home, females were disproportionately burdened with having to juggle both care and their work, even disproportionately more so, even if both parents were working from home. The kids were still, the research is showing that kids were still more likely to go into their mommy or whatever and interrupt their working day, or even if they were trying to do split shifts. So for that reason, it had a real negative impact, and I don't think we have actually seen that play through to full fruition yet, because the implications of that are only going to be seen through time, through career progression, because if you are trying to juggle too many things, you're trying to work and you're trying to look after children and you're trying to do everything, it's impossible. Like, nobody can do all of that. So some things were given, and we know this from the research which is coming through. So I think in years to come, we'll start to see males not having their working days interrupted, or the implication of this playing through into their working lives as much. So I think COVID will actually have a detrimental impact as time goes on the extent of the gender pay gap.
Thanks. Elisa, Gareth?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And if I cast my mind back to kind of March 2020, it seems like a lifetime ago in some ways, and then in another way, it seems like yesterday. But if we go back to March 2020, our union kind of put forward 3 strategic demands as the whole pandemic was hitting Ireland. I know it hit Italy and China and other places elsewhere, but as it was really impacting us, we had 3 strategic demands. One was pausing redundancies, that the banks wouldn't impose redundancies during the pandemic. Another was obviously health and safety. We had to look after and protect some of the most vulnerable workers working in locations and branches, etc. But the third one was around protecting pay for anyone who had caring responsibilities, either for children or for elderly people as well, so that no one was disadvantaged by having to juggle, as Lisa put it, all of those different pressures that were on us in March and April and May, and right up to still now to some degree. So it was making sure that no one was disadvantaged from pay perspective, because, as Lisa pointed out, rightly or wrongly as it is, a lot of those caring responsibilities was going to fall on women. So we had to make sure that pay was protected and they weren't losing out in the initial period. I think Dr. Lisa is absolutely correct. The longer term implications of this, we don't quite know yet in terms of career progression. It's something we're going to have to keep an eye on and come up with the right demands with our members in terms of trying to address that. But certainly in the immediacy, we were really conscious as a trade union that pay protection was vital. And not just pay protection, but also that if you had to juggle care and responsibilities, etc., you weren't going to be disadvantaged in 2 ways. One, from a performance management and a performance rating point of view, because that obviously in many cases has an impact then on your pay increase. So a kind of a secondary element to pay. We had to make sure that you weren't disadvantaged for that. And also that those periods of juggling things were not treated as absences or as absence management or as sick leave, because again, that just wouldn't be right or fair, and it would actually have potentially a gender discrimination element towards that. So we were really keen as a union to prioritize that kind of level of pay protection. But I do think we've got to think now about what's the next phase of this, and is there actually almost a subjective or a biased impact upon career progression as maybe particularly promotional opportunities come up next year and the year after, in that kind of medium term? Is there a look back bias upon who worked through the pandemic and possibly who didn't? And I'm not quite sure we have the right demand yet around that, but it's something that we're going to have to really keep an eye on in the next period of time.
I'll stay with you now for my next question. So what are the FSU's next steps? What can those listening or viewing do in terms of being aware of the gender pay gap?
And so obviously, I mean, the first thing I would say to anyone listening here is, get a copy of the report. It's on our website, or pick it up from our office. But have a read of the report. It's definitely not the final say on this by any stretch of the imagination, but it is our contribution, and it's an early contribution in terms of analysing the gender pay gap, explaining the gender pay gap, and then putting forward some initial kind of concrete demands. Because one of the weaknesses, I suppose, we identified ourselves was when we talked to employers, well, what do we want? What's our list of actions? What do we want employers to do? So this was very much us putting out our first, this is actually what we want employers to do. And we've got to see more of that, because we actually need, as a trade union movement, and for any trade union officials or shop stewards listening to this broadcast, we really need to incorporate equality issues more generally, not just the gender pay gap, but equality issues more generally into our mainstream collective bargaining agenda. Collective bargaining shouldn't just be about pay and job security, as it often is. That's vitally important, but it needs to be about gender pay gap. It needs to be about having supports for menopause in the workplace, having the right domestic violence policies, and all of these other items as well are really, really important to people's working life and working experience. So I'd encourage anyone listening to this to take some of the ideas and bring them back into your union if you're a shop steward or a union official, and begin to put claims on employers. Say, I want to talk to you about gender pay gap. What is it? Like, even if the legislation isn't in place yet, I want you to publish your gender pay gap information and do an analysis. So as a union, we've engaged with the minister. We've also engaged with a number of MLAs, and we're going to continue to put that pressure on. We'll work with our colleagues like Dr. Lisa Wilson, Ethel Buckley and SIPTU, Esther Lynch and the ETUC, all these great trade unionists, to just broaden this out. It's not just FSU. I think Lisa identified that our sector has a particular critical issue in terms of the scale of the gender pay gap, but it's certainly a more widespread issue as well. And so in the next couple of weeks, we'll be writing to all of our employers with a copy of this report and essentially opening those negotiations, very conscious that we're to some degree privileged in that we are collectively bargaining and we are we're a union that's recognized in our sector. There's a hell of a lot of workers in non-union private sector who don't have that. So again, I'd encourage you to start talking to your colleagues and start organizing your sector, and talk to FSU and talk to other trade unions about how unions can help you organize your sector so that you can actually try and change your work to be better and take on issues like gender pay and pay more generally.
Thanks, Gareth. Lisa, the final word on this to you. What do you think companies should be targeting as a reduction target each year? Or how long do you think it should take to close the gap? Is it that straightforward?
It's a difficult answer to give, to say, you should have a particular target, a particular company should have this target, because, if the gender pay gap is different across different companies, and this is why it's so important to set within that collective bargaining framework, and to see this as something that, we're not just going to close next year, or, we're going to understanding the reasons and behind the gender pay gap is fundamental. And that's why I think it's actually much more sensible what the FSU is doing here, to try and understand the gender pay gap and to understand the things that are driving the gender pay gap, and then to put in place the actions, because only through doing that will you actually get real change, because otherwise you're facing with a situation where it's too disparate, I think, to try and to say, if this company has a gender pay gap, by in 2 years' time it should be this, but there should definitely still be within the collective bargaining framework a requirement for action on the structural causes behind the gender pay gap, and to look, for example, one of the key things that I'm always emphasizing around the gender pay gap is how absolutely fundamental part-time work is, and to drive in the gender pay gap, for two reasons. Part-time employment is significantly less paid than full-time employment, and also those in part-time work are much less likely to have opportunities for career progression, for training, for all of those other things. But we also know that females are much more likely to work part-time. So, you have to tackle both things there, not just get females into more likely to do full-time work, which would, narrow the gender pay gap, but not for those who remain in part-time employment. So you have to do both things at once. You have to look at tackle the reasons. Why is it that people who are working part-time getting paid less than their full-time counterparts, and why is it that females are more likely to work part-time than males? And very often, and this is something that's unspoken about, or spoken about not enough when it comes to understanding the gender pay gap, very often males in the labour market don't actually have opportunities to work part-time work, or are seen as failing in their engagement in the labour market if they're working part-time. Well, that's a woman's job. Women work part-time, women take care of the kids, and it has a negative impact on the career progression of males then as a result. So they're choosing not to do it. So having opportunities for flexible working and part-time employment in a way that doesn't have a detrimental impact on your opportunities for progression, but also on your actual pay, is fundamental to doing this. So I'd much prefer to see particular actions required in terms of targets around part-time and full-time, for example, or targets around part-time and full-time pay, than to say your gender pay gap needs to be X next year, because it's too complicated to just do that. I think that, and that's why the collective bargaining framework allows unions to work with the employer to say, well, these might be some of the reasons. Let's look at the information here and let's look at how we can get there through a set of agreed actions, rather than this is the target ultimately.
Thanks very much, Lisa. And I think we'll leave it there today, panel. Thank you both very much. I think that was a very insightful conversation. And I think the gender pay gap certainly will not close itself, unless there are interventions. And I think until there are government, societal and employer supports and purposeful interventions in Ireland that reduce the assumptions that in the main, it is women who put their careers on hold, either by temporarily leaving the workforce or reducing the time spent working due to caring, domestic and other duties that they have, until that fundamentally changes. And of course, the gender pay gap also exists in the north of Ireland. And as Gareth said, we look forward to bringing the campaign to the Stormont politicians for action. Thanks again to the panelists, and good afternoon.